Leviticus chapter 1. Yahweh called Moses, and from the tent of meeting addressed him, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel. Say to them, when anyone brings an offering of an animal to Yahweh, it can be from either his cattle or sheep and goats. If the offering is a burnt offering of one of his cattle, he is to offer a bull without any defect. He shall offer it at the entrance of the tent of meeting, so that his offering may be accepted before Yahweh. He is to lay his hand on the bull's head, and it shall be accepted as a sacrifice to take away his sins. Then he shall kill the bull before Yahweh, and the sons of Aaron the priest shall offer the blood. They will pour it out on the sides of the altar, which stands at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then he shall skin the victim and quarter it. The sons of Aaron the priest must put fire on the altar and arrange wood on this fire. Then the sons of Aaron the priest are to put the pieces, the head and the fat on the wood on the altar fire. The man shall wash internal organs and legs in water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. This will be a burnt offering, and its sweet-smelling odor will please Yahweh. If this offering is an animal out of the flock, a lamb or a goat offered as a burnt offering, he is to offer a male without any defect. He shall kill it on the north side of the altar before Yahweh, and the sons of Aaron the priest shall pour out the blood on the sides of the altar. Then he is to quarter it, and the priest is to arrange the quarters, as well as the head and the fat on the wood on the altar fire. The man shall wash the internal organs and legs in water, and the priest shall burn all of it on the altar. This will be a burnt offering, and its sweet-smelling odor will please Yahweh. If the man is offering a bird as a burnt offering, he is to offer a turtle dove or a young pigeon. The priest shall offer it at the altar and wring off its head, which he is to burn on the altar. Then its blood is to be drained out on the side of the altar. Then he shall remove the crop and the feathers. These he is to throw on the eastern side of the altar, where the ashes from the fat are placed. He is to divide it in 2 halves, with a wing on each side, but without separating the 2 parts. Then the priest shall burn it on the altar, on the wood that is on the fire. This will be a burnt offering, and its sweet-smelling odor will please Yahweh. Leviticus chapter 2. If anyone offers Yahweh a grain offering, his offering is to be fine flour, on which he is to pour oil and put incense. He shall bring it to the sons of Aaron the priest. He is to take a handful of the fine flour and oil and all the incense, and the priest shall burn it on the altar as a memorial, a burnt offering whose sweet-smelling odor will please Yahweh. The remainder of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. This is a most holy share, for it comes from the burnt offerings of Yahweh. When you are going to offer a grain offering of bread baked in the oven, the fine flour is to be prepared either in the form of unleavened cakes mixed with oil, or in the form of unleavened wafers spread with oil. If your offering is a grain offering fried on the griddle, the fine flour mixed with oil is to have no leavening. You must break it in pieces and pour oil over it. It is a grain offering. If your offering is a grain offering cooked in the pan, the fine flour is to be prepared in oil. You must bring to Yahweh the grain offering that has been thus prepared, presenting it to the priest, who is to bring it to the altar. The priest shall take part of this offering and burn it on the altar to recall before Yahweh the person who is offering. And it will be an offering whose sweet-smelling odor will please Yahweh. The remainder of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his priests. This is a most holy share of Yahweh's burnt offering. None of the grain offering that you offer to Yahweh is to be prepared with yeast, for you must never burn yeast or honey as a burnt offering for Yahweh. You may offer them up to Yahweh as an offering of first fruits, but they must not go up as a sweet-smelling odor to please Yahweh. You must salt every grain offering that you offer, and you must never fail to put on your grain offering the salt of the covenant with your God. To every offering you ought to join an offering of salt to Yahweh your God. If you offer Yahweh a grain offering of first fruits, it may be from either roasted corn or bread made from ground corn. You ought to add oil to it and put incense on it. It is a grain offering, and the priest is to burn part of the bread and oil together with all the incense as a burnt offering for Yahweh. Leviticus chapter 3. If anyone offers a peace sacrifice, offering from his cattle, male or female, whatever he offers before Yahweh must be without any defect. He is to lay his hand on the victim's head and kill it at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then the sons of Aaron the priest shall pour out the blood on the sides of the altar. Then he is to offer the following as a burnt offering for Yahweh: the fat that covers the internal organs, all the fat that is on the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, the fat on them and on the loins, the best part which he is to remove from the liver and kidneys. The sons of Aaron shall burn all this on the altar, along with the burnt offering, on the wood on the fire. It will be a burnt offering, and its sweet-smelling odor will please Yahweh. If he offers a sheep or goat as a peace offering for Yahweh, he is to offer a male or female without any defect. If he offers a sheep, he is to offer it before Yahweh. He is to lay his hand on the sheep's head and kill it in front of the tent of meeting. Then the sons of Aaron shall pour out its blood on the sides of the altar. Of the peace offering, he is to offer the following as a burnt offering for Yahweh: the fat, all the tail taken off near the backbone, the fat that covers the internal organs, all the fat that is on the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, the fat that is on them and on the loins, the best part which he will remove from the liver and kidneys. The priest shall burn this part on the altar as food, as a burnt offering for Yahweh. If his offering is a goat, he is to offer it before Yahweh. He is to lay his hand on the goat's head and kill it in front of the tent of meeting. And the sons of Aaron shall pour out its blood on the sides of the altar. Then he is to offer the following as a burnt offering for Yahweh: the fat that covers the internal organs, all the fat that is on the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, the fat that is on them and on the loins, the best part which he will remove from the liver and kidneys. The priest shall burn these pieces on the altar as food, as a burnt offering for Yahweh. All the fat belongs to Yahweh. This is a law forever for all your descendants, wherever they may live. Never eat either fat or blood. Leviticus chapter 4. Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "Speak to the people of Israel and say, anyone may sin without intending to do so against any of the commandments of Yahweh and do one of the forbidden things. In such a case, if the one who sins is the anointed priest, the sin defiles the people. Then for the sin which he has committed, he is to offer to Yahweh a young bull, an animal from the herd without any defect, as a sacrifice for sin. He is to bring the bull before Yahweh at the entrance to the tent of meeting and lay his hand on its head and kill it before Yahweh. Then the anointed priest shall take a little of the blood of the bull and take it into the tent of meeting. He shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it over the veil of the sanctuary 7 times before Yahweh. Then the priest shall put a little of the blood of the bull on the corners of the altar of incense that sends up smoke before Yahweh in the tent of meeting, and he is to pour all the rest of the bull's blood at the foot of the altar for burnt offerings, that is at the entrance to the tent of meeting. From this bull offered as a sacrifice for sin, the priest will remove all the fat that covers the internal organs, all the fat that is on the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, the fat that is on them and on the loins, the best part which he will remove from the liver and kidneys, exactly as was done with what was set apart in the peace offering. And the priest shall burn these on the altar for burnt offerings. The bull's skin, all its flesh, its head, legs, internal organs, and intestines, the whole of the bull, must be carried outside the camp to a place that is clean, the place where the ashes from the fat are thrown away, and the bull must be burnt there. If the whole community of Israel has sinned without intending to do so, and without being aware of it, has done something that is forbidden by the commandments of Yahweh, the community is to offer a young bull as a sacrifice for sin, an animal of the herd without any defect. As soon as the sin of which they have been guilty is discovered, the animal must be brought before the tent of meeting. The eldest of the community shall lay their hands on the bull's head before Yahweh, and it must be killed before Yahweh. Then the anointed priest is to carry a little of the blood of the bull into the tent of meeting. He is to dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it on the veil before Yahweh 7 times. Then he shall put a little of the blood on the corners of the altar that stands before Yahweh inside the tent of meeting, and pour out all the rest of the blood at the foot of the altar for burnt offerings at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then the priest shall remove all the fat from the animal and burn it on the altar. He shall do the same thing with this bull as he did with the bull of the sacrifice of sin. When the priest has performed the sacrifice for people's sin, they will be forgiven. The priest must have the bull taken out of the camp and burn it as he burned the first one. This is the sacrifice for the sin of the community. When a leader sins and without intending to do so, does one of the things forbidden by the commandments of Yahweh his God, thus becoming guilty, and after that he recalls it, or anyone calls his attention to the sin thus committed, he is to bring a goat as an offering, a male without any defect. He is to lay his hand on the goat's head and kill it in the place where the animals for the burnt offerings are killed. This is a sacrifice for sin. The priest shall take a little of the goat's blood on his finger and put it on the corners of the altar for burnt offerings. Then he shall pour out its blood at the foot of the altar for burnt offering, and burn all the fat on the altar, as with the fat in the peace offering. This is how the priest is to offer the sacrifice for the sin of this leader to free him from his sin, and he will be forgiven. If one of the people sins without intending to do so and makes himself guilty by doing something forbidden by the commandments of Yahweh, and after that he recalls it, or anyone calls his attention to the sin he has committed, he is to bring a goat as an offering, a female without any defect. He is to lay his hand on the goat's head and kill it in the place where the animals for the burnt offerings are killed. The priest shall take a little of the goat's blood on his finger and put it on the corners of the altar for burnt offerings. Then he shall pour out all the rest of the blood at the foot of the altar. He shall remove all the fat, as the fat was removed for the peace offering, and the priest shall burn it on the altar as a sweet-smelling sacrifice pleasing to Yahweh. This is how the priest is to offer the sacrifice for the man's sin, and he will be forgiven. If anyone wishes to bring a lamb as an offering for this kind of sacrifice, he is to bring a female without any defect. He is to lay his hand on the lamb's head and kill it as a sacrifice for sin in the place where the animals for the burnt offerings are killed. The priest shall take a little of the blood of this sacrifice on his finger and put it on the corners of the altar for burnt offerings. Then he shall pour out all the rest of the blood at the foot of the altar. He shall remove its fat, as was done for the sheep in the peace offering, and the priest shall burn it all on the altar, in addition to the burnt offering for Yahweh. This is how the priest is to offer the sacrifice for the man's sin, and he will be forgiven. Leviticus chapter 5. Sacrifice for sin is required in the following cases. A man should have come forward to give evidence in court when officially summoned, but he did not speak and give information about something he had seen or heard, and so he is guilty. Or else he accidentally touches something unclean, whatever it may be, the dead body of an unclean animal, wild or tame, or the dead body of one of the unclean beings that swarm, and so without realizing it, he becomes unclean and guilty. Or else he accidentally touches some human uncleanness, whatever it may be, and contact with it makes him unclean. So he becomes guilty as soon as he realizes what he has done. Or else a man makes a careless vow to do either evil or good in any of those matters on which a man may swear unthinkingly. He does not notice it then, but when he realizes it later, he becomes guilty. He who is guilty in any of these cases shall confess the sin committed and bring to Yahweh as a sacrifice for the sin committed a female of the flock, sheep or goat, and the priest shall offer the sacrifice for the man's sin to free him from his sin. If a man cannot afford a sheep or a goat, he shall offer to Yahweh as payment for the sin he has committed 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a sacrifice for sin and the other for a burnt offering. He will bring them to the priest, who is to offer first the one intended for the sacrifice for sin. The priest shall wring its neck without removing the head. He shall sprinkle the side of the altar with the victim's blood, and then drain out the rest of the blood at the foot of the altar. This is a sacrifice for sin. Of the other bird, he is to make a burnt offering according to the regulations. When the priest offers the sacrifice for the man's sin, he will be forgiven. If this man cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, he is to bring 2 pounds of flour as an offering for the sin committed. But he shall not mix oil with it or put incense on it, for it is a sacrifice for sin. He is to bring it to the priest, who is to take a handful of it to be put on the burnt offering for Yahweh, in order to recall this man to Yahweh. This is a sacrifice for sin. This is how the priest is to offer the sacrifice for the sin the man committed in any of these cases, and he will be forgiven. In this case, as in the case of a grain offering, the rest of the flour belongs to the priest. Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "If anyone is guilty of unintentionally cheating by failing to hand over the payments that are sacred to Yahweh, he is to bring Yahweh as a sacrifice of payment a ram with no defects. This ram is to be valued according to the official standard. This is a sacrifice of repayment. He must make the payments he has failed to hand over, pay an extra fifth as well, and give it to the priest. The priest shall offer the ram as a sacrifice for the man's sin, and he will be forgiven. If anyone sins and does one of the things forbidden by the commandments of Yahweh without realizing it, he is guilty and must pay the penalty for his fault. As a sacrifice of repayment, he is to bring to the priest a ram without any defect. Its value will be according to the official standard. The priest shall offer the sacrifice for the sin he has committed without realizing it, and he will be forgiven. This is a sacrifice of repayment, for the man was guilty in the eyes of Yahweh. Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "This refers to the man who sins against Yahweh by not returning to his neighbor a deposit or a security, or withholding something due to him, or cheating him, and also to the one who finds lost property and swears he has not found it, and also to the man who swears falsely in one of the cases in which people usually swear. In all these cases, the man who sins and becomes guilty is to give back what he has taken or demanded that does not belong to him, the deposit entrusted to him, the lost property that he found, or any object about which he has sworn untruthfully. He must repay the owner in full and give an extra fifth as well on the day which he is found guilty. Then he is to bring a ram without any defect to Yahweh as a sacrifice of repayment. The priest shall offer the sacrifice for the man's sin, and he will be forgiven, whatever the act of which he became guilty." Leviticus chapter 6. Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "Give these regulations to Aaron and his sons. This is the regulation for burnt offerings. The burnt offering shall stay on the altar all night until morning, and the fire is to be kept burning. The priest is to put on his linen shirt and his linen drawers. Then he must remove the greasy ashes of the sacrifice consumed by the altar fire and place them at the side of the altar. Then he is to change his clothes and carry the ashes to some place that is clean outside the camp. The fire that consumes the burnt offering on the altar must not be allowed to go out. Every morning, the priest must put firewood on it, arrange the burnt offering on it, and burn the fat from the peace offerings. An undying fire is always to burn on the altar. It must not go out. This is the regulation for the grain offering. One of the priests, a son of Aaron, is to bring it into the presence of Yahweh in front of the altar. He is to take a handful of the fine flour with the oil and incense which have been added to it and burn it on the altar as a memorial to recall to Yahweh the person making the offering, so that it becomes a sweet-smelling odor pleasing to Yahweh. After that, the remainder is to be given to Aaron and his sons. They shall eat it in the form of unleavened loaves. They are to eat it in a sacred place within the courtyard of the tent of meeting. The share I give them of my burnt offering must not be baked with yeast. It is most holy, like the sacrifice for sin and sacrifice of repayment. All the males of Aaron's family may eat this part of Yahweh's burnt offering. This is a law forever for all your descendants. Everything that touches the offering becomes consecrated as well. Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "This is the offering that Aaron and his sons are to make to Yahweh on the day of their anointing as priests. 2 pounds of flour as a daily offering, half in the morning and half in the evening. It must be fried on the griddle and mixed with oil. You must bring the paste as a grain offering in several pieces, offering them as a sweet-smelling odor pleasing to Yahweh. Every descendant of Aaron who succeeds him as high priest shall do the same. This is a law forever. This grain offering shall be completely burned as a sacrifice for Yahweh. Every grain offering made by a priest must be a total sacrifice. None of it is to be eaten." Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "Say to Aaron and his sons, this is the regulation for the sacrifice for sin. The victim for the sacrifice is to be killed before Yahweh in the place where the animals for the burnt offerings are killed. It is a most holy offering. The priest who offers this sacrifice is to eat it. It must be eaten in a holy place within the courtyard of the tent of meeting. Everything that touches the flesh of this animal will become consecrated. If any of the blood splashes on clothing, the stain must be cleaned in some holy place. The clay pot in which the meat is cooked must be broken. If a bronze pot has been used for the cooking, it must be scrubbed and thoroughly rinsed with water. Any male who is a priest may eat the meat. It is a most holy thing, but no one may eat any part of the animals offered for sin. Whenever any of the blood is brought into the tent and used in the sacrifice to take away sin, the meat must be thrown on the fire. Leviticus chapter 7. This is the regulation for the sacrifice of repayment. It is a most holy offering. The animal for this offering is to be killed in the place where the animals for the burnt offerings are killed, and the priest must pour out the blood on the sides of the altar. Then he is to offer all the fat, the tail, the fat that covers the internal organs, the 2 kidneys, the fat that is on them and on the loins, and the best part which he will remove from the liver and kidneys. The priest must burn these pieces on the altar as a burnt offering for Yahweh. This is a sacrifice of repayment. Any male who is a priest may eat it, but it must be eaten in a holy place, because it is a most holy thing. As with the sacrifice for sin, so with the sacrifice of repayment. The regulation is the same for both. The offering which he has used in the sacrifice for sin belongs to the priest. The skin of the animal presented by a man to the priest to be offered as a burnt offering belongs to the priest. Every grain offering baked in the oven, every grain offering fried in the pan or on the griddle shall belong to the priest who offered it. Every grain offering mixed with oil or dry is to belong to all the sons of Aaron equally. This is the regulation for the peace offering presented to Yahweh. It is offered as a thanksgiving offering. There must be added to it an offering of unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers spread with oil, and fine flour in the form of cakes mixed with oil. This offering, then, must be added to the loaves of leavened bread and to the thanksgiving offering. One of the cakes of this offering is to be presented as an offering to Yahweh. It shall belong to the priest who pours out the blood of the peace offering. The flesh of the animal must be eaten on the day when the offering is made. Nothing must remain until the next morning. If the animal is presented before Yahweh as a sacrifice freely offered, it is to be eaten on the day it is offered and also on the following day. But on the 3rd day, whatever remains of the animal's flesh must be thrown on the fire. If the meat offered as a peace offering is eaten on the 3rd day, the man who has offered it shall not be accepted, nor receive credit for it is defiled meat, and the man who eats it should suffer the penalty of his fault. If this meat has touched anything unclean, it cannot be eaten, and must be thrown on the fire. Anyone who is clean may eat meat of the peace offering, but whoever eats the meat of a peace offering presented to Yahweh, even though he is unclean, shall be cut off from his people. If anyone touches anything unclean, whether human or animal, or any crawling creature, and then eats the meat of a peace offering presented to Yahweh, this man shall be cut off from his people. Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, You must not eat the fat of ox, sheep, or goat, the fat of an animal that has died a natural death, or been killed by a wild animal, may be used for any other purpose, but you must not eat it. Anyone who eats the fat of an animal offered as a burnt offering to Yahweh shall be cut off from his people. Wherever you live, you must not eat blood, whether it be of bird or animal. Anyone who eats blood, whoever he may be, shall be cut off from his people." Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, Anyone who offers a peace offering to Yahweh is to bring himself the part of his sacrifice that is offered to Yahweh. He is to bring Yahweh's burnt offering, that is, the fat that is near the breast, and also the breast, with his own hands. Then he will make the gesture of offering before Yahweh. The priest shall burn the fat on the altar, and the breast shall belong to Aaron and his sons. You must set aside and give to the priest the right hind leg from your peace offering. The right hind leg shall be the share of the son of Aaron who offers the blood and fat of the peace offering. Thus I keep back this breast and hind leg out of every peace offering presented by the sons of Israel, and give these to Aaron the priest and to his sons. This is a law for the sons of Israel forever. This is the share of Aaron and his sons in Yahweh's burnt offerings since the day he called them to be his priests. This is what Yahweh commands the sons of Israel to give them from the day they are ordained as priests. This is a law for all their descendants for all time to come. Such is the regulation for burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrifices for sin, sacrifices of repayment, ordination, and peace offerings. This is what Yahweh commanded Moses on Mount Sinai when he told the people of Israel to make their offerings to Yahweh in the wilderness of Sinai. Leviticus chapter 8. Yahweh spoke to Moses. He said, "Take Aaron, his sons with him, and the vestments, the anointing oil, the bull for the sacrifice for sin, the 2 rams, and the basket of unleavened bread. Then call the whole community together at the entrance to the tent of meeting." Moses did as Yahweh commanded. The community gathered at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And Moses said to them, "This is what Yahweh has commanded." He made Aaron and his sons come forward and washed them with water. He put the shirt on Aaron, passed the sash around his waist, dressed him in the robe, and put the ephod on him. Then he tied around his waist the woven hand of the ephod with which he clothed him. He put the embroidered linen breastpiece on him and placed the Urim and Thummim in it. He put the turban on his head with the golden ornament on the front. This is the sacred sign of dedication as Yahweh commanded Moses to do. Then Moses took the anointing oil and anointed the holy tent and everything in it to consecrate them. He sprinkled the altar 7 times and anointed the altar and its furnishings, the basin and its stand, to dedicate them all to Yahweh. Then he ordained Aaron by pouring the anointing oil on his head. Then Moses made Aaron's sons come forward. He put the shirts on them, tied the sashes around their waists, and put on their headdresses, as Yahweh had commanded him to do. Then he had the bull for the sacrifice for sin brought forward. Aaron and his sons, their hands on the bull's head, and Moses slaughtered it. Then he took the blood and with his finger put some of it on the corners around the altar to take away its sin. Then he poured out the rest of the blood at the foot of the altar, which he dedicated to Yahweh by performing the atonement over it. Then he took all the fat that covers the internal organs, the best part of the liver, the 2 kidneys and their fat, and he burnt them all on the altar. After that, he burned outside the camp the bull's skin, its flesh and its intestines, as Yahweh had commanded him to do. Then he had the ram for the burnt offering brought forward. Aaron and his sons laid their hands on its head, and Moses slaughtered it. He poured its blood out on the sides of the altar. Then he quartered the ram and burned the head, the pieces and the fat. He washed the internal organs and legs and burned the whole ram on the altar. This was a burnt offering, a sweet-smelling offering to Yahweh, a burnt offering by fire for Yahweh, as Yahweh had commanded Moses. Then he had the other ram brought forward for the sacrifice of ordination of priests. Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the ram's head, and Moses slaughtered it. He took some of its blood and put it on the lobe of Aaron's right ear, the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot. Then he made the sons of Aaron come forward, and he put some of the blood on the lobes of their right ears, the thumbs of their right hands, and the big toes of their right feet. Next Moses poured the rest of the blood on the sides of the altar. Then he took the fat, the tail, all the fat that is on the internal organs, the best part of the liver, the 2 kidneys and their fat, and the right hind leg. From the basket of unleavened bread placed before Yahweh, he took an unleavened cake, a loaf of bread made with oil, and a wafer. He placed these on the fat and the right hind leg, put it all into Aaron's hands and those of his sons, who waved them before Yahweh. Then Moses took them back and burned them on the altar in addition to the burnt offering. This was the sacrifice for ordination of priests, a sweet-smelling offering to Yahweh, an offering by fire to Yahweh. Then Moses took the breast and made the gesture of offering before Yahweh. This was the share of the ram of ordination for Moses, as Yahweh had commanded. Then Moses took the anointing oil and the blood that was on the altar and sprinkled Aaron and his vestments with it, and his sons and their vestments. In this way, he consecrated Aaron and his vestments, and his sons and their vestments to Yahweh. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons, "Cook the meat at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and eat it there, and also the bread for the sacrifice of priestly ordination that is in the basket, as I commanded when I said, 'Aaron and his sons are to eat it.' What remains of the meat and bread you will burn. For 7 days you must not leave the entrance to the tent of meeting until the time of your ordination is over, for your hands will be consecrated for 7 days. All that we have done today is the rite of atonement for you, as Yahweh has commanded us to do, and for 7 days, day and night, you must remain at the entrance to the tent of meeting, doing what Yahweh has commanded, lest you die. For this is the commandment I received." And Aaron and his sons did everything that Yahweh had commanded through Moses. Leviticus chapter 9. On the 8th day, Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. He said to Aaron, "Take a calf to offer a sacrifice for sin, and a ram for a burnt offering, both without any defect, and bring them before Yahweh. Then say to the people of Israel, 'Take a goat to be offered as a sacrifice for sin, and as burnt offering a calf and a lamb, both 1 year old and without any defect, and for peace offering an ox and a ram to be slaughtered before Yahweh, and finally a grain offering mixed with oil, for Yahweh will appear to you today.' They brought what Moses had commanded in front of the tent of meeting. Then the whole community gathered and stood before Yahweh. Moses said, "This is what Yahweh has commanded to be done, so that His glory may appear to you." Moses then said to Aaron, "Go to the altar and offer your sacrifice for sin and your burnt offering to take away your sins. Then present the people's offering to take away their sins as Yahweh has commanded." Aaron went to the altar and slaughtered the calf as a sacrifice for his own sin. Then the sons of Aaron presented the blood to him. He dipped his finger in it and put some on the corners of the altar, and then poured out the rest of the blood at the foot of the altar. The fat of the sacrifice for sin and the kidneys and the best part of the liver he burned on the altar, as Yahweh had commanded Moses. The flesh and the skin he burned outside the camp. Next, Aaron slaughtered the animal, which was for his own burnt offering. His sons handed him the blood, and he poured it on the sides of the altar. Then they handed him the quartered animal and its head too, and he burned these on the altar. He washed the internal organs and legs and burned them on the altar, in addition to the burnt offering. He then presented the people's offering. He took the goat for the people's sacrifice for sin, killed it, and offered it as a sacrifice for sin in the same way as the first. Then he had the animal for the burnt offering brought forward and offered it according to the regulations. Next, he had the grain offering brought forward, took a handful of it, and burned it on the altar in addition to the morning burnt offering. Finally, he slaughtered the ox and the ram as a peace offering for the people. Aaron's sons handed him the blood, and he poured it out on the sides of the altar. The fat of the ox and of the ram, the tail, the fatty covering, the kidneys, the best part of the liver, all of this he laid on the breasts and burned it all on the altar. With the breasts and the right hind leg, Aaron made the gesture of offering by waving them as Yahweh had commanded. Then Aaron raised his hands toward the people and blessed them. Having thus performed the sacrifice for sin, the burnt offering and the peace offering, he came down and entered the tent of meeting with Moses. Then they came out together to bless the people, and the glory of Yahweh appeared to the whole people. A flame leaped forth from before Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the fat that was on the altar. At this sight, the people shouted for joy and fell on their faces. Leviticus chapter 10. Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron, each took his censer, put fire in it, and incense on the fire, and presented unlawful fire before Yahweh, fire which he had not commanded them to present. Then from Yahweh's presence a flame leaped out and burned them to death in the presence of Yahweh. And Moses said to Aaron, "That is what Yahweh meant when he said, 'I will show my holiness through those who approach me, and before all the people I will show my glory.'" And Aaron had to remain silent. Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, sons of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come and take the corpses of your brothers far away from the sanctuary, out of the camp." they came and carried them away, still in their shirts, out of the camp, as Moses had commanded. Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not leave your hair uncombed, nor tear your clothes to show that you are mourning, lest you die and the punishment extend to the whole community. All the people of Israel shall mourn the death of your brothers who died because of Yahweh's fire. But you shall not leave the entrance to the tent of meeting, lest you die. For the anointing of oil of Yahweh is on you." And they obeyed Moses. Yahweh spoke to Aaron. He said, "Before coming to the tent of meeting, you and your sons with you, do not drink wine or strong drink, lest you die. This is a law for all your descendants for all time to come, so that you may be able to recognize the difference between what belongs to God and what is for general use, between what is clean and what is unclean. For you must teach the people of Israel all the laws that Yahweh has given for them through Moses." Moses said to Aaron and his two remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, "Take the grain offering that is left over from Yahweh's burnt offering and eat it without leaven beside the altar, because it is a most holy thing. Eat it in a holy place, for it is the share of Yahweh's burnt offering which belongs to you and your sons. This is what Yahweh commanded me. The breast that was offered up and the hind leg that was set aside, you will eat in some place that is clean, you and your sons and your daughters with you. This is the share of the peace offerings of the people of Israel that belongs to you and your sons. The hind leg that was set aside and the breast that was offered up when the fat was burned belong to you and your sons with you, after they have been presented before Yahweh by the gesture of offering, because Yahweh has commanded this forever." Then Moses inquired about the goat offered as a sacrifice for sin and found that they had burned it. He was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, Aaron's two remaining sons. "Why," he asked, "did you not eat this goat in the holy place? For it is a most holy thing given to you to bear and take away the fault of the community. Since its blood was not taken inside the sanctuary, you should have eaten its flesh there, as I commanded you." Aaron said to Moses, "They have offered their sacrifice for sin and their burnt offering before Yahweh on the day of mourning. If I had eaten the goat offered in sacrifice for sin today, would that have seemed good to Yahweh?" And when Moses heard this, he was satisfied. Leviticus chapter 11. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron and said to them, "Speak to the people of Israel and say, of all the animals on the earth, these are the animals you may eat. You may eat any animal that has divided hoofs, divided into two parts, and that also chews the cud. You may not eat the camel, because though it chews the cud, it does not have divided hoofs. The rabbit, because though it chews the cud, it does not have divided hoofs. The hare as well. The pig, because though it has divided hoofs, it does not chew the cud. You must not eat the meat of such animals, nor their dead bodies. They are unclean for you. Of all that lives in water, you may eat anything that has fins and scales, and lives in sea river. But anything living in sea or river that does not have both fins and scales must not be eaten. They are unclean for you. You shall not eat their flesh, nor even touch their dead bodies. Anything that lives in water but does not have fins and scales is unclean for you. Among the birds, here are those you must consider unclean and not eat: the vulture, the eagle, the osprey, the hawk, the several kinds of buzzards, all kinds of ravens, the ostrich, the screech owl, the seagull, the horned owl, the night owl, the seabird, the barn owl, the ibis, the pelican, the white vulture, the stork, the several kinds of heron, and the bat. All winged insects that move on 4 feet shall be unclean for you. Of all the winged insects, you may eat only the following: those that have legs above their feet, so that they can leap over the ground. These are the ones you may eat: the several kinds of locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers. But all other winged insects that have 4 legs you ought to consider unclean. Anyone who touches or picks up the dead bodies of one of these animals will be unclean until evening. The same with animals that have hoofs, unless their hoofs are divided and they chew the cud, and also 4-footed animals which walk on the flat of their feet. Anyone who picks up their dead bodies must wash his clothing and will be unclean until evening. These are the small animals crawling on the ground that shall be unclean for you: rats, mice, and several kinds of lizards, the gecko, the chameleon, the agama, the skink, and the mole. Anyone who touches them when they are dead will be unclean until evening. Anything on which the dead body of any of these creatures falls becomes unclean: wooden utensil, clothing, skin, sackcloth, any utensil at all. It must be dipped in water and will remain unclean until evening. Then it will be clean. If the creature falls into a clay pot, the pot must be broken. Whatever the pot contains is unclean. Any food on which water from such a pot has poured will be unclean. Anything on which the dead body of such a creature may fall will be unclean. If it is a clay stove or oven, this must be broken, for they are unclean, and you must treat them as unclean. A spring or cistern for collecting water remains clean, but whoever touches the dead body becomes unclean. If one of their dead bodies falls on any seed whatever, the seed will remain clean. But if the seed has been wet and such a dead body falls on it, then you must consider it unclean. If one of the animals that you use as food dies, then anyone who touches the dead body will be unclean until evening. Anyone who eats the meat of the dead animal must wash his clothing and will be unclean until the evening. And anyone who picks up the dead body will also be unclean until the evening and has to wash his clothing. All the creatures that swarm on the ground are unclean and may not be eaten. Everything that crawls on its belly, or goes on 4 legs, or has many legs, may not be eaten. Do not defile yourselves with any swarming creature that might defile you, for I am Yahweh your God. Take the way of holiness and be holy, for I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean with any of the creatures that swarm on the ground. For I am Yahweh, who brought you from the land of Egypt, that I might be your God. Be holy, because I am holy. This is the law for animals and birds, and for every living creature that moves in the water or that crawls on the ground. Let everyone distinguish between the clean and the unclean, between creatures that may be eaten and creatures that may not. Leviticus chapter 12. Yahweh spoke to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, when a woman gives birth to a male child, she shall be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her monthly period. On the 8th day, the child is to be circumcised. Then she shall wait for 33 days to be purified of her bleeding. She shall not touch anything that is consecrated, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. If she gives birth to a daughter, she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation. Then she shall wait 66 days to be purified from her bleeding. And when the days of her purification are completed, whether for a son or daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the door of the tent of meeting a lamb born that year for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. The priest shall then offer it to Yahweh to make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is the law for the woman who gives birth to a child, male or female. But if she cannot offer a lamb, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for a burnt offering, the other for a sin offering. The priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be purified. Leviticus chapter 13. Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "If someone has a boil, an inflammation, or a sore on his skin, which could develop into leprosy, he must be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of the priests, his descendants. The priest shall examine him, and if the hair on the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the surrounding skin, then it is indeed the sore of leprosy. When the priest sees this, he shall declare that person unclean. But if the sore is white and does not appear to be deeper than the skin around it, and the hairs have not turned white, the priest is to isolate the sick person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall again examine him. If he sees that the sore looks the same and has not spread on the skin, he shall isolate the sick person for another 7 days, and once more examine him on the 7th day. If the sore has faded and has not spread on the skin, the priest shall declare that person clean. It was only eczema. Let him wash his clothes, and he will be clean. But if the sore spreads over the skin after the sick person has been examined by the priest and declared clean, then he must present himself again to the priest. After examining him and finding that the sore has spread over the skin, the priest must declare him unclean. It is leprosy. When a leprous disease strikes a man, he must be taken to the priest, who must examine him, and if he finds on the skin a whitish swelling which turns the hair white, and an ulcer is forming, then it is leprosy in the skin, and the priest must declare him unclean. It is useless to isolate him for a time. He is unclean. But if the leprosy spreads all through the skin, if it covers him entirely from head to foot, so far as the priest can see, then the priest must examine the sick person, and if he finds that the leprosy covers his whole body, declare the sick person clean. Since it has all turned white, he is clean. But as soon as an open sore appears on him, he will be unclean. After examining the sore, the priest is to declare him unclean. The open sore is leprous. But if the sore becomes white again, the man must go to the priest. The priest shall examine him, and if he finds that the disease has turned white, he shall declare the sick person clean. He is clean. When an ulcer appears on a person's skin, which after healing leaves a whitish swelling or a shiny spot of reddish white, that person must show himself to the priest. The priest shall examine him, and if he finds a spot deeper than the surrounding skin, and the hairs in it have turned white, he shall declare him unclean. It is a case of leprosy that has broken out in a boil. But if on examination the priest finds neither white hair in it nor a deep spot on the skin, but it is lighter in color, he shall isolate the sick person for 7 days. If the disease has indeed spread over the skin, he shall declare him unclean. It is a case of leprosy. But if the shiny spot remains unchanged and has not spread, then it is only the scar of a boil, and the priest is to declare the man clean. If someone has had a burn, and on the burn an ulcer forms, a shiny spot reddish white or whitish in color, then the priest must examine it. If he finds that the hairs in that spot have turned white, and it seems to be deeper than the surrounding skin, this means that leprosy has broken out in the burn. The priest shall declare the man unclean. It is a case of leprosy. If, on the other hand, the priest on examination does not find white hair on the mark, and it is not deeper than the surrounding skin, but is light in color, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 days. On the 7th day, he shall examine him, and if the disease has spread on the skin, he shall declare him unclean. It is a case of leprosy. If the mark is still unchanged and has not spread over the skin, but instead is light in color, this means that it is only a swelling due to the burn. The priest shall declare the man clean. It is merely a burn scar. If a man or woman has a sore on the head or chin, the priest must examine this sore. And if it seems to be deeper than the surrounding skin, with the hair on it yellow and thin, he must declare the sick person unclean. It is a dreaded skin disease, that is to say, leprosy of the head or chin. If on examining this case, the priest finds no spot which seems deeper than the surrounding skin, and no yellow hair, he shall isolate the person for 7 days. He shall examine the infected part on the 7th day, and if he finds that the disease has not spread, that the hair on it is not yellow, and that there is no spot which seems deeper than the surrounding skin, the sick person will shave his hair, all except the part affected with the disease, and the priest is to isolate him again for 7 days. He must examine the infected part on the 7th day, and if he finds that it has not spread over the skin, and that there is no spot which seems deeper than the surrounding skin, the priest shall declare the sick person clean. After washing his clothes, he will be clean. But if after this purification the disease does spread over the skin, the priest must examine him. If he finds that it has indeed spread over the skin, this means that the sick person is unclean, and there is no need to look and see whether the hair is yellow. Whereas if, so far as he can see, the disease has not spread and dark hair is beginning to grow on it, this means that the sick person is cured. He is clean, and the priest is to declare him clean. If shiny spots break out on the skin of a man or woman, and if these spots are white, the priest must examine them. If he finds them to be a dull white, it is a rash that has broken out on the skin. The sick person is clean. If a man loses the hair on top of his head, that is baldness of the scalp, but the man is clean. If he loses his hair from the front of the head, this is baldness of the forehead, but the man is clean. If, however, a reddish white sore appears on the top of his head or forehead, this means that leprosy has broken out. The priest must examine it, and if he finds a reddish white swelling on the head or forehead, which looks like leprosy of the skin, this means that the man is leprous, he is unclean. The priest shall declare him unclean. He is suffering from leprosy of the head. A person infected with leprosy must wear torn clothing and leave his hair uncombed. He must cover his upper lip and cry, "Unclean, unclean." As long as the disease lasts, he must be unclean, and therefore he must live away from others. He must live outside the camp. When a mark of mildew appears on a piece of clothing, woolen or linen clothing, linen or woolen textile material or covering, leather or leather work, and if this clothing, textile material, covering, leather or leather work appears greenish or reddish, it is a spreading mildew to be shown to the priest. The priest must examine it and put the object away for 7 days. If on the 7th day he observes that the mildew has spread on the garment, textile material, covering, leather or leather work, whatever it may be, it is a case of spreading mildew and the object is unclean. The priest will burn this clothing, textile material, linen or woolen covering, leather article of any kind on which the mildew has spread and which must be destroyed by fire. But if on examination the priest finds that the mildew has not spread on the clothing, textile material, covering or leather object, whatever it may be, he is to order the object to be washed and is to isolate it again for a period of 7 days. After the cleansing, he must examine it again, and if he finds that the mildew has not changed color, even though it has not spread, the article is unclean. It must be destroyed by fire. But if on examination the priest finds that the mildew has faded after washing, he is to cut it out of the clothing, leather, textile material or covering. But if the mildew reappears on the same clothing, textile material, covering or leather article, whatever it may be, this means that the mildew is spreading again and the owner must destroy the article by fire. The clothing, textile material, covering or leather article, whatever it may be, from which the mildew disappears after washing, is to be clean after it has been washed a second time. Such is the law for a case of leprosy in a linen or woolen garment, in textile material, in clothing, or in anything of skin, for judging whether it is clean or unclean. Leviticus chapter 14. Yahweh spoke to Moses, "This shall be the law for the leper on the day of his purification. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall take him outside the camp and examine him. And if the person has been healed from leprosy, the priest shall order 2 live, clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop for the one who is to be cleansed. The priest shall also give orders that one of the birds be slain on an earthenware pot over fresh water. He shall take the live bird and also the cedar wood, the crimson yarn, and the hyssop, and he will plunge them together, including the live bird, in the blood of the bird that was slain over fresh water. Then he will sprinkle the one to be purified 7 times. After that he shall declare him clean, and he shall let the live bird go free over the open fields. The person to be purified must wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and bathe himself in water. Then he will be clean. After this he may enter the camp, but he must stay outside his tent for 7 days. On the 7th day he shall shave off all the hair on his head, chin, and eyebrows. He shall wash his clothes, bathe himself in water, and then he will be clean. On the 8th day he is to take 2 lambs and a yearling ewe lamb, all without defect, and 3 tenths of a measure of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, and a log of oil. The priest who declares him clean shall present the man to be purified and his offerings before Yahweh at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest will then take the first lamb and present it as a guilt offering together with the log of oil. He shall wave them before Yahweh. He shall slaughter the male lamb in the place where they slaughter the sin offering and the burnt offering, the holy place. For the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest shall then take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be purified, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The priest shall take the log of oil and pour it on the palm of his own left hand. Then, dipping his right forefinger in it, he shall sprinkle it 7 times before Yahweh. Then he is to take a little of the oil that remains in the palm of his hand and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the man who is being purified, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, over the blood of the sacrifice of reparation. The rest of the oil, which is in his palm, he shall put on the head of the man who is being purified. In this way he shall perform over him the rite of atonement before Yahweh. Then the priest shall offer the sacrifice for sin and perform the rite of atonement for the man who is being purified. After this, he must slaughter the animal for the burnt offering and offer it with the grain offering on the altar. When the priest has performed the rite of atonement over him in this way, the man will be clean. If the leper is poor and cannot afford all this, he shall take only 1 lamb for the guilt offering, to be offered with the gesture of offering in the rite of atonement. And for the grain offering, he will bring only 1/10 of beaten flour mixed with oil, and the log of oil, and finally 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, if he can afford them, one to be used as a sacrifice for sin, and the other for the burnt offering. On the 8th day, he must bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting before Yahweh for his purification. The priest is to take the lamb for the guilt offering and the log of oil and present them before Yahweh with the gesture of offering. Then he must slaughter the lamb for the guilt offering, take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the man who is being purified, on the thumb of his right hand and on the big toe of his right foot. He is to pour the oil into the palm of his left hand, and with this oil he must make 7 sprinklings with his finger before Yahweh. He is to put some of it on the lobe of the right ear of the man who is being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, as he did with the blood of the guilt offering. The remainder of the oil in the palm of his hand he must put on the head of the man who is being purified, performing the rite of atonement over him before Yahweh. Of the 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, if he can afford them, he is to offer a sacrifice for sin with one, and with the other a burnt offering together with a grain offering, if he can afford them. In this way, the priest will have performed before Yahweh the rite of atonement over the person who is being purified. Such is the law concerning a person afflicted by leprosy, who cannot afford the means for his purification. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron. He said, "When you reach the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your inheritance, if I strike a house with mildew in the land you are to possess, the owner must come and warn the priest. He must say, 'I have seen something like mildew in the house.' The priest is to give orders for the house to be emptied before he goes to examine the infection. Thus nothing in the house will be declared unclean. Then the priest must go and look at the house, and if on examination he finds reddish or greenish spots that appear to be eating into the wall, the priest is to go out of the house to the door and shut it up for 7 days. On the 7th day he shall go back again, and if on examination he finds that the infection has spread over the walls of the house, he shall give orders for the affected stones to be removed and thrown into some unclean place outside the town. Then he shall have all the inside of the house scraped, and the plaster that comes off must be emptied out into an unclean place outside the town. The stones must be replaced by new ones, and the house given a new coat of plaster. If the infection spreads again after the stones have been removed and the house scraped and replastered, the priest is to come and examine it. If he finds that the infection has spread, this means that mildew is affecting the house. It is unclean. It must be pulled down, and the stones, woodwork, and all the plaster be taken to an unclean place outside the town. Anyone who enters the house while it is closed will be unclean until evening. Anyone who sleeps there must wash his clothing. But if the priest finds, when he comes to examine the infection, that it has not spread in the house since it was plastered, he is to declare the house clean, for the infection is cured. As a sacrifice for the sin of the house, he is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, red cord, and a sprig of hyssop. He shall slaughter one of the birds in an earthenware pot over running water. Then he shall take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the red cord, and the live bird, and dip them into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered and into the running water. He shall sprinkle the house 7 times, and after having offered a sacrifice for the sin of the house with the blood of the bird, the running water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the red cord, he shall set the live bird free to fly out of the town into the open country. When the rite of atonement has been performed over the house in this way, it will be clean. Such is the law for all cases of dreaded skin diseases, mildew of clothing and houses, swellings, scabs, and shiny spots. It defines the cases when things are unclean and when they are clean. Such is the law on leprosy. Leviticus chapter 15. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron. He said, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man has a discharge from his body, that discharge makes him unclean. The rules about his uncleanness are whether his body allows the discharge to flow or whether it retains it, he is unclean. Any bed the man lies on and any seat he sits on shall be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who sits on a seat where the man has sat must wash his clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the body of a man so affected must wash his clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. If the sick man spits on someone who is clean, the person must wash his clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. Any saddle the sick man travels on will be unclean. All those who touch any object that may be under him will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up such an object must wash his clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. All those whom the sick man touches without washing his hands must wash their clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. Any clay pot the sick man touches must be broken, and any wooden utensil must be rinsed. When the man suffering from a discharge is cured, he must allow 7 days for his purification. He must wash his clothing and take a bath in running water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day, he must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and come before Yahweh at the entrance to the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest is to offer a sacrifice for sin with one of them and with the other a burnt offering. So the priest will perform the rite of atonement before Yahweh for the man's discharge. When a man has a seminal discharge, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he shall be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather touched by a seminal discharge must be washed, and it will be unclean until evening. When a woman has slept with a man, both of them must take a bath, and they will be unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge of blood, and blood flows from her body, this uncleanness of her monthly periods shall last for 7 days. Anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Any bed she lies on will be unclean. Any seat she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed must wash his clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches any seat she has sat on must wash his clothing and take a bath and will be unclean until evening. If there is anything on the bed or the chair on which she sat, anyone who touches it will be unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with a woman who is unclean because of her monthly period, he shall be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. If a woman has a flow of blood for several days outside her period, or if her period is prolonged, during the time this flow lasts, she shall be unclean as during her monthly periods. Any bed she lies on during the time this flow lasts will be unclean as during her monthly period. Any seat she sits on will be unclean, as it would be during her monthly periods. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothing and take a bath, and will be unclean until evening. When she is cured of her flow, she will let 7 days pass. Then she will be clean. On the 8th day, she is to take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. With one of them, the priest is to offer a sacrifice for sin, and with the other, a burnt offering. This is the way in which the priest will perform the rite of atonement over her before Yahweh for the flow that made her unclean. Make the sons of Israel aware of everything unclean, lest they die because of defiling the tent of my presence among them. Such is the law concerning a man with a discharge, anyone made unclean by a seminal discharge, a woman unclean because of her monthly periods, a man or a woman with a discharge, a man who sleeps with an unclean woman.